Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Tech Talk. This is issue number 253. As always, you can find my newsletter at jimmysong.substack.com. Altcoins are DINOs, decentralized in name only. Bitcoin Tech Talk issue number 253. The biggest DeFi hack ever was on the Poly network across multiple chains that amounted to $600 million in value. The smart contract was obviously flawed and had a bug which the hacker was able to exploit. I don't really like calling these people hackers because in a sense they're doing something that any good lawyer would do with a normal contract. That is, looking through the terms of the contract for advantages they can get. A lot of the media treat this perfectly legal execution of the contract as something that was sinister, when it's really a flaw with the complicated smart contracts themselves. There wasn't a server that was hacked into or a key stolen from somebody. There was simply an overlooked, badly coded clause in the smart contract that was executed. In a smart contract, code is supposed to be law, so to call this person a hacker is dishonest. It's a person that executed the contract in a way the designers of the smart contract didn't expect. This is just a terribly managed project, and the blame is entirely on the developers and the poor quality platform that made such mistakes so easy to make. The insecurity of smart contracts in a poorly designed language like Solidity isn't the thing I want to write about, however. The more interesting thing here is the hack, which was nominally worth $600 million, was settled as a $500,000 bug bounty. What happened, and how was it the hacker settled for so little? Shortly after the disaster, the Poly network sent out a tweet to ask for the money back, as can be seen above. What is very interesting is the embedded threat that you will be pursued. Again, this was a legal execution of the contract, so it's not at all clear that the authorities would be pursuing this person. But the threat apparently had teeth. Why? The key is the next sentence about not doing any further transactions. This was because the Polygon developers essentially got the cooperation of miners and exchanges to completely censor this one address. For all their talk of decentralization, a centralized organization was able to block a user from spending. In other words, Ethereum and Binance are centralized chains. You do not own these coins as much as have access to them with the central controller's permission. This was done through choking liquidity. Surely, the hacker could have sold the coins peer-to-peer and possibly even mined the transaction, but it would have been extremely annoying to anonymize and would not have gotten the same price as the untainted coins. That the settlement was for $500,000 tells you that coins that the central organization disapproved of is worth less than 0.1% of the coins that are approved. Another way to look at it is that over 99.9% of the value is dependent on a trusted third party. In essence, this hack proves that altcoins, for all their talk of decentralization, are decentralized in name only, DINO, and are utterly centralized in everything that matters. This means that there are significant risks, both internal, embezzlement, inflation, censorship, and external, regulations, forced takeover, taxes. In other words, these are fragile projects, and dependence on them is an enormous risk. I wanted to write this particular article because it really struck me just how much control these centralized players have. If something happens on their network that they don't like, they can sort of like issue a fatwa or something against the person that did something that they didn't like. And right now it's against quote unquote hackers or whatever. But there's no reason to believe that it won't extend to other people that they don't like in the future. And this is a really big risk. And this is the reason why you go with a decentralized token in the first place, is for the ability of the central controller to not be able to do this. And yet, this is exactly what it did, and there's no decentralization at all about that, right? Like being able to do that. Eric Voorhees did something similar when he was internally hacked years ago with Shapeshift, and he basically called up all the other exchanges and said, "Can you not accept any coins from this address?" And I think he got something like a settlement with the hacker, and he was able to get back a large portion of the money at a fraction. And that's that just shows how centralized it is. If if you can go around and essentially use the centralized controllers to your advantage, it's really no better than fiat. And there's no better example of that than what just happened. All right, let's talk about Bitcoin. BitMEX Research has published the privacy-preserving proof of liability. The protocol uses a Merkle tree of all user accounts, which can be looked up using a nonce given to each user. The amounts are put in the clear so the users can add them up to see the liabilities. The innovation is splitting the amounts to two or more different nodes in the Merkle tree. This preserves privacy better, as a particular amount being seen in the Merkle tree cannot be used to track users over time. Sadly, proof of liability is not very common in the industry, with CoinFloor being one of the few exceptions. I hope a better protocol like this gets users to demand them from exchanges going forward. So it's a really cool idea, and I think it was based on something that Greg Maxwell proposed a while back, and this is what CoinFloor uses. It's essentially you give each user a nonce, and they use their account number plus the nonce and hash it together to go look up the liability for the exchange. And presumably, if the user is checking every month and the amount that the exchange is liable for is different than what it should be, then they can basically call their bluff and tell everybody, hey, these guys aren't being legit, something to that effect. The only problem with that is that if the amounts have to be in the clear, right? Like, so if you have 10 Bitcoin on there and it's 10 Bitcoin month after month, people can figure out, okay, that's actually a user account and somebody has 10 Bitcoin on there. By splitting it up, it makes it much harder to do that sort of analysis. If it's like 10.135 or something like that, something specific, and it's there at month after month, it's pretty obvious that it's a particular user that has that, and that's bad for privacy. But if you split up that 10.153 to something like 5 Bitcoins and 4 Bitcoins and 1.513 Bitcoins, something like that, and put them in as three separate entries, then it's much harder. And if you sort of randomize that or put them into powers of two, something like that, it's a lot easier to figure out, and you can shuffle the Merkle tree in whatever way, and it makes it a lot more secure. Samurai Wallet has published parts 3 and 4 of the Understanding Privacy series. These two articles are, again, very informative, and they go through the difference between PayJoin and CoinJoin, techniques for defeating traditional analysis, and the general starting point problem. If you're interested in privacy, this is not a bad place to start. They've published 4 articles now on the privacy series, 2 last week, 2 this week, and all of them are pretty good, and I applaud them for writing these so users especially can understand the issues behind chain analysis and how it's actually conducted and what mitigations there are. Craig Warmke of Atomic Finance explains DLCs. The post goes through what motivated the development of DLCs, and as they say, this is a useful tool to make sound finance available in Bitcoin. The usage of oracles in DLCs is essentially the only single point of failure, and there are incentives available to get them to tell the truth. The article is useful for understanding this whole area of Bitcoin that's coming in more layman's terms. So DLCs are really interesting and cool, and Atomic Finance has been sort of experimenting with various things. I believe they have like options, Bitcoin options that you can buy and sell on a peer-to-peer level, which is really cool. I believe they're only doing like call options right now, but you can do that as long as you have an oracle and everything gets settled in Bitcoin. All right. Jeremy Rubin has started a fairly controversial proposal to remove the dust limit in Bitcoin. The behavior of the current software is to consider outputs less than 546 Satoshis as spam. His reasoning is that there are other uses for outputs such as colored coins protocols, Lightning, and authentication delegation. A lot of developers are pushing back, some even suggesting a higher limit than the current one. This is not a consensus issue, so it will be interesting to see how this gets resolved. So there's nothing stopping a miner from putting in like 1 Satoshi outputs. It's that if you have outputs that are less than 546, and it's not really getting relayed. So this isn't a consensus thing. It's more sort of like a network convention thing. So Jeremy could very easily like fork Bitcoin and remove the dust limit on his fork. Luke does something similar with other features with Bitcoin knots and so on. But I mean, there is something to be said about this 546 limit because as Satoshis get more expensive and so on, it'll capture bigger and bigger at least dollar value. So I think he makes some good points. I think the developers that are pushing back are also making good points. But yeah, it's a good discussion to be paying attention to. Let's talk about Lightning. Blockstream has implemented a way to advertise a willingness to do dual funded channels called liquidity ads. There's no way before this to know which other nodes would accept dual funded channels. So advertising what you would accept ought to be very useful for the network. This is part of the C Lightning release 0.10. So, they created this whole thing called dual funded channels. But there's, in order to dual fund, you need to know which peers would be open to doing that, and that they would essentially, have liquidity. You would get inbound liquidity for some outbound liquidity, and that's a very useful thing, and especially knowing what. How much you would have to provide in order to get what, and so on. It can be very useful, and I expect, as we move more towards dual funded channels, this particular thing called liquidity ads will become more important on the Lightning Network. Lightning address is a way to make Lightning more user-friendly. This is a clever use of the DNS system to host your own Lightning node from a domain you control. Addresses ought to be a lot easier to use, but there is a trade-off in privacy since your domain has to be registered with someone, and that can compromise your privacy. So essentially what it does is it makes it look a lot like an email address, and using basically a Lightning node on the back end, it can receive to a particular node that it's hooked up to and give an invoice, and there's sort of like communication going back and forth in the background between whoever is trying to pay and that address to complete the actual Lightning transaction. So very clever. I thought it was awesome, and maybe it becomes the standard instead of node IDs, which are not that intuitive. Red Phone is a Lightning-based phone service. You can connect to another Lightning node over the peer-to-peer network to establish a web RTC connection. The software allows you to have pay-per-minute services and so on, which you would expect given that Lightning allows for such payments. This is a clever use of Lightning, and I hope more services like this pop up. So, this was from the Impervious AI hackathon. And the guy that made it, I think, put it together fairly quickly. But very exciting project. You can essentially have a peer-to-peer phone call with no central party in the middle. You're using WebRTC to do the actual call, but in order to find each other, you need Lightning, and if you're paying, if one side is paying, then they can do so using Lightning and so on. Really clever, and I love the fact that there's no central party that's able to even record anything, because of course all the communication is encrypted. So, very much better than the current system, which all have some sort of third party as a trusted central third party, in messaging apps, spanning from WhatsApp to Facebook Messenger to Telegram or Signal or even, FaceTime or whatever. This one I think is towards that decentralized web we're all looking for. Economics, engineering, etc. Alex Gladstein writes about how Bitcoin is being used in Cuba. What's amazing is how organic the growth there has been and how oppressive Cuba currently is. The fact that Cubans are using Bitcoin to subvert their government is encouraging, and perhaps there is a better future ahead in that very authoritarian country. As usual, Alex's long reads give us a really good global perspective on the effect of Bitcoin, and this is another must-read for those interested in the global implications of Bitcoin. I thought the article was fantastic, and he interviewed a lot of people in Cuba for the story, and it just goes to show how how authoritarian Cuba actually is. A lot of people forget that it's still kind of a communist country. And a lot of the abuses of communism, the state basically owns the people, so they can do whatever they want with them. Their main source of revenue is farming out their medical staff to other countries and getting money that way, which is a form of slavery, honestly. But yeah, it's the amount of Bitcoin stuff that's happening there is surprising and encouraging. Lynn Alden shows why Bitcoin's energy use is not a problem. This is a thorough debunking of the ESG narrative around Bitcoin, and she doesn't skip any details. She covers the why, the how, layers about Bitcoin, and of course how Bitcoin uses energy no one else uses. She's always been a very clear thinker, and her explanations are likewise very clear. Though I hope the ESG narrative dies a horrible, bloody death, I suspect that this is an argument we'll need to make continuously for the next 10 years. So this is definitely not the first article addressing energy, but Lynn has a way of sort of framing it in the context of what's going on, which I thought was very helpful. And she's easier to read for a variety of reasons, and her clear thinking shows through. So enjoyed that article. Sean Dexter has an article on how Bitcoin is an escape from the current oppressive system. The article starts from first principles about the emergence of private property to government taxes and inflation. The article makes clear where things went wrong and how Bitcoin can fix private property. There is an undercurrent of two worlds starting to form, one fiat and one Bitcoin, and this article suggests that we're starting to come to that. Where that goes is something worth pondering. And, we're seeing that, right? Like where you do have like AML KYC on the fiat side and really no requirements on the Bitcoin side other than, running your own node possibly. One's very much permission based, the other is permissionless. And this is becoming a big divide in the world today where, you need permission from governments to move around in certain countries now, even like democracies, or supposed democracies like Australia, and other places where you can just do whatever. We're seeing a big divide there, and this seems like something worth watching from a political perspective. Chinese miners are venue shopping. This is not a surprise, as they have a lot of very valuable property. Given the regulatory certainty in Texas and Governor Abbott basically inviting disaffected miners in, Texas looks to be a big beneficiary of the jobs and economic activity that comes along with the establishment of mining. as people like me have been predicting for years, the hash rate will go to the jurisdictions that are most favorable for them. And it wasn't going to be China's permanently. We're seeing this play out in real time. And yeah, I think we can put the China mining FUD to bed at this point because they really are moving to more regulatorily certain jurisdictions. And like even if the Chinese government wanted to at this point, they couldn't capture more than 50% of the hash rate. They've kicked most of these miners out. Jason Lowry makes the argument for how Bitcoin is mutual assured preservation. His argument that the military is a form of proof of work for any currency makes a lot of sense. The biggest guns essentially get to decide what property rights each person has. Proof of work is much more peaceful and creates incentives to preserve one another rather than go to war. I found the analogy to have a lot of truth in it and gives perspective on the cost of property rights for a society. So essentially what he's saying is that, war or military or the police state or the ability of the government to be able to enforce its laws, both internally and externally, that's what gives any currency its teeth. And I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that. He's also known as a member of the Space Force and just joined Twitter, and he's kind of exploded in the last week. But yeah, those thoughts in there about mutually assured preservation are quite original and very interesting. I recommend you read them if you can. Bitcoin is making waves in the political arena. I think the past couple of weeks have shown just how influential Bitcoin has become. And a lot of Bitcoiners are going and calling Congress. They didn't care at all about the infrastructure issue until that clause was put in. So it'll be interesting to see how this all sort of plays out in the political arena because, Bitcoiners are clearly a constituency at this point. Will Bitcoin put the third world in leadership positions going forward? It's an article by Obi, who has a weekly column for BTC Times. And I think he's right. There's a class of countries that are trying to make CBDCs and control their populace that way. And there's another class of countries that are just using Bitcoin for their currency. The ones with Bitcoin are going to win. And I firmly believe that. Congrats to John A. Tech, who's receiving a grant from HRF and Compass Mining. Politics, as we know it, is likely over on a Bitcoin Standard. This is part of Robert Breedlove's Sovereigntism series. Very interesting idea that politics, as we know it, has evolved essentially from fiat money. Worth reading. Bosworth makes $4,500 a month running routing lightning payments. And that was a little bit of a shocker to me that he made that much. But then again, Alex Bosworth has been, deep in the weeds on Lightning for quite a while now, and he's been running his nodes for many years on a continuous basis with some pretty fat channels. So it'll be interesting to see if he can keep that up, but that's not a small amount of money. So good for him. Events. I will be at BitBlock Boom in Dallas on August 26th to 29th. Token 2049 is in London, England on October 7th and 8th. And Atlanta has TabConf on November 4th and 5th. I will be at all three. I am doing the programming blockchain seminar in London and Atlanta, October 9th and 10th, and November 2nd and 3rd. I do have, some scholarships available, and if you're interested, you can apply at the link on programmingblockchain.com. Podcast. On this week's Bitcoin Fixes This, I talked to Scott Horton about the military-industrial complex and the U.S. Foreign policy since 1979 that led us to seemingly endless military intervention in the Middle East. So this is kind of topical since, Afghanistan has been retaken over by the Taliban. I think listening to Scott and sort of understanding what's gone on there and just sort of screwing up each time and trying to go in there with war to fix the last screw up has basically made things worse and worse and worse. And it's not a surprise that the Taliban were able to hold out and win essentially, because they're fighting for home territory, and like none of these countries like U.S. occupation, and that's a big sore spot for all of them. I read through last week's newsletter, which you can find on anchor.fm. I was on the Jason Kavanagh's show to talk Bitcoin. I also talked about the moral case for Bitcoin with Liberty Lighthouse. And there's also part 2 of the conversation I had with Blue Collar Money. And Roes Henna has written a post based on the new book, and it's talking about Bible and Bitcoin. My other books are the Little Bitcoin book and Programming Bitcoin, which you can find on Amazon. And lastly, Unchained Capital is a sponsor of this newsletter. I'm an advisor and proud to be a part of a company that's enhancing security for Bitcoin holders. If you need multi-sig collaborative custody or Bitcoin native financial services, learn more at unchained.com. Fiat Delenda S, this song is done.